The Predator drone circled overhead like a silent guardian angel, its sensors scanning the mountainous terrain for additional threats. Morrison watched the tactical display on the helicopter's communication system as the drone operator identified and eliminated enemy positions along their flight path. Each Hellfire missile strike was precisely calculated to destroy Taliban fighting positions while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties in nearby villages. But, even with air support, the extraction was becoming increasingly complicated. Taliban forces throughout the region were mobilizing in response to the operation, and radio intercepts indicated that enemy commanders were coordinating a large-scale effort to bring down the helicopters. The original flight plan called for a direct route to the forward operating base, but that path was now blocked by enemy forces. The lead pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, "SEAL 7, we're going to have to take the long way home. Enemy forces have blocked the primary route, and we don't have enough fuel for an extended firefight." Morrison understood the implications immediately. The alternate route would take them over territory that was even more hostile, through valleys where Taliban forces had established permanent strongholds. It would add 20 minutes to their flight time and expose them to additional risks, but it was their only option for avoiding a major engagement with enemy forces. Chen finished his medical assessment of the team and moved to check on the engineer. The captured bomb maker had remained silent throughout the extraction, but his eyes showed that he was taking in every detail of the operation. As a former professor, he had the intelligence to understand American military procedures, and Morrison wondered what information he might be gathering for future use. The engineer looked up at Chen as the medic checked his restraints and examined him for injuries. In accented English, he said, "You are very young to be a soldier." Chen looked at Morrison for guidance before responding. "Old enough to do my job." The engineer smiled slightly. "I taught students your age at the university. They had dreams of building things, creating technology to help their people. Now I build things that destroy." His expression became sad. "War changes everyone it touches." Morrison intervened before the conversation could continue. Intelligence had briefed the team about the engineer's background, including his skills as a manipulator and propagandist. The man was attempting to establish a personal connection with Chen, possibly hoping to gain sympathy or gather information about the team. The helicopter banked sharply to the right as it followed the alternate route through a narrow valley. The mountainsides rose steeply on both sides, creating a natural corridor that limited the pilot's maneuvering options. It was exactly the kind of terrain that Taliban forces preferred for ambushes, offering multiple elevated positions while restricting the movement of aircraft. Rodriguez was monitoring Taliban communications frequencies, listening to enemy commanders coordinate their response to the extraction. The intelligence specialist's face was grim as he translated the intercepted radio traffic. Enemy forces were moving to establish blocking positions along all possible escape routes, and they had apparently called in reinforcements from neighboring provinces. "Sir, they've got at least 200 fighters converging on our general area," Rodriguez reported. "They're setting up ambush positions at 3 different choke points along the route." Morrison studied the tactical map on his tablet, comparing their current position with the locations Rodriguez had identified. The Taliban forces were being methodical in their approach, using terrain features and pre-positioned weapons caches to create multiple kill zones. It was exactly the kind of tactical thinking that had made them such effective opponents over the years. The drone operator's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Nighthawk flight, I'm tracking a large group of vehicles moving to intercept your route. Recommend immediate course change to heading 270. The helicopter pilot responded immediately, banking toward the new heading while the second aircraft followed close behind. The evasive maneuver took them deeper into Taliban territory, but it was necessary to avoid the converging enemy forces. Morrison could see through the window that they were now flying over villages that had never seen coalition forces, areas where Taliban control was absolute. Williams moved to the window and scanned the terrain below with his binoculars. The experienced NCO had an eye for tactical situations, and Morrison valued his assessment of potential threats. After several minutes of observation, Williams turned back to Morrison with a concerned expression. "Sir, I'm seeing a lot of movement down there. Looks like they're positioning fighters along the ridgelines, probably with heavy weapons." Morrison looked through his own binoculars and confirmed Williams's assessment. Dark figures were moving along the mountain ridges on both sides of the valley, carrying what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. The Taliban forces were preparing for a coordinated attack on the helicopters, timing their movements to catch the aircraft in a crossfire. The lead pilot had apparently reached the same conclusion: SEAL 7, we're going to punch it through this valley. Recommend everyone hang on. Both helicopters accelerated to maximum speed, their engines straining against the thin mountain air. The pilots were flying as low as possible to minimize their exposure to enemy fire, but the narrow valley limited their options for evasive maneuvering. Morrison could feel the aircraft vibrating as it pushed against the limits of its performance envelope. The first burst of enemy fire came from the left ridgeline, tracer rounds streaking past the lead helicopter's rotor system. The door gunner immediately returned fire, his machine gun chattering as he engaged targets on the mountainside. The second helicopter's gunner joined the firefight, creating a wall of suppressive fire that forced the enemy fighters to take cover. Morrison watched the tactical display as the drone above them identified additional enemy positions. The unmanned aircraft was limited in the number of targets it could engage simultaneously, but it was systematically working through the priority threats. Each missile strike eliminated a fighting position and reduced the overall enemy capability. Suddenly, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked between the two helicopters, missing the lead aircraft by less than 10 meters. The explosion behind them lit up the valley, and Morrison could feel the shock wave through the helicopter's airframe. Taliban fighters were getting the range, and their accuracy was improving with each shot. The engineer looked up at Morrison during the exchange of fire, his expression unreadable. "Your helicopters are impressive machines," he said calmly, as if discussing the weather rather than a life-or-death situation. "But machines can be defeated by men who are willing to sacrifice everything." Morrison ignored the comment, but the man's calm demeanor was unsettling. Most prisoners would be terrified in this situation, but the engineer seemed almost pleased by the chaos surrounding them. Morrison wondered if the bomb maker had additional information about Taliban plans that he wasn't sharing. Chen was monitoring the prisoner while simultaneously preparing to treat any casualties from the ongoing firefight. The team medic had positioned his medical supplies for easy access and was ready to respond immediately if any team member was wounded. His dual role as both medic and combatant required constant mental switching between two completely different mindsets. Another burst of tracer fire erupted from the right ridgeline, this time more accurate than before. Morrison could hear bullets striking the helicopter's armor plating, creating a drumming sound that mixed with the noise of the engines and rotor system. The pilots were pushing their aircraft to the limit, but they couldn't outrun the enemy forever. The radio crackled with a new voice: "Nighthawk Flight, this is Eagle 26. We're inbound to your position with close air support." Morrison looked through the window and could see the distinctive silhouette of an A-10 Thunderbolt approaching from the east. The heavily armed ground attack aircraft was specifically designed to provide close air support in exactly this type of situation. Its 30mm cannon and precision-guided weapons would be devastating against enemy positions on the ridgelines. The A-10 pilot's voice was calm and professional. "Nighthawk Flight, maintain current heading and speed. We'll clear the path ahead of you." The attack aircraft dove toward the left ridgeline, its cannon firing a continuous stream of depleted uranium rounds at enemy positions. Morrison could see the impacts walking along the mountainside, each round creating small explosions as it struck rock and earth. Taliban fighters who had been firing at the helicopters suddenly found themselves under attack by one of the most feared weapons in the American arsenal. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Enemy fire from the left ridgeline stopped completely as fighters either fled or were eliminated by the A-10's attack. The pilot banked sharply and turned toward the right ridgeline, where more enemy positions had been identified by the Predator drone overhead. But the Taliban forces were not finished. As the helicopters approached the end of the valley, new threats appeared ahead of them. A pair of technical vehicles armed with heavy machine guns had positioned themselves on the valley floor, creating a blocking position that the helicopters would have to pass directly over. The lead pilot's voice was tense, multiple vehicles ahead, heavily armed. "We're going to have to fight through." Morrison could see the technical vehicles through the helicopter's front windscreen. Each truck mounted a heavy machine gun that could potentially bring down a helicopter with sustained fire. The vehicles were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, forcing the aircraft to run a deadly gauntlet to escape the valley. The A-10 pilot had also identified the threat. Nighthawk flight, I have visual on the ground vehicles. Engaging now. The attack aircraft rolled into another dive, this time targeting the trucks on the valley floor. Its cannon fired in short, precise bursts, each one designed to destroy a specific target. Morrison watched as the first technical vehicle disappeared in a ball of fire and smoke, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions. The second truck tried to change position, but the A-10's second attack run eliminated it before it could find new cover. The pilot's marksmanship was impressive even by special operations standards, each cannon burst placed with surgical precision to destroy the target while minimizing collateral damage. Williams pointed toward a ridge ahead of their position. Sir, looks like they've got more vehicles moving into position up there. Morrison followed Williams's gaze and could see additional technical vehicles positioning themselves on high ground ahead of their flight path. The Taliban forces were adapting to the air support, positioning their weapons where the A-10 would have difficulty engaging them without risking the helicopters below. The drone operator's voice confirmed the new threat. Nighthawk flight, I'm tracking 6 additional vehicles on the ridgeline ahead. They're positioning for an ambush at the valley exit. Morrison realized that the Taliban commanders were executing a sophisticated tactical plan. They had used the initial ambushes to channel the helicopters into a predetermined kill zone, where concentrated fire from elevated positions would make escape nearly impossible. It was exactly the kind of tactical thinking that had made Taliban forces such effective opponents. The lead pilot was apparently reaching the same conclusion. SEAL 7, we're going to have to take a different route out of this valley. The exit is blocked, and we don't have enough fuel for an extended firefight. Morrison looked at the tactical map again, searching for alternatives. The valley had only 2 exits, and Taliban forces now controlled both. The mountainsides were too steep for the helicopters to climb directly, and flying back the way they had come would mean facing all the enemy positions they had already passed. Rodriguez was still monitoring enemy communications, and his expression was increasingly concerned. Sir, they're calling in more reinforcements. Sounds like they've got fighters moving in from 3 different directions. The situation was becoming critical. The helicopters were running low on fuel, enemy forces were converging on their position, and their escape routes were being systematically blocked. Morrison had been in desperate situations before, but this was among the worst. The Taliban forces had apparently been planning this operation for weeks, perhaps anticipating that American forces would eventually target the engineer. Chen looked up from his medical preparations and caught Morrison's eye. The young medic's expression was calm and determined, showing no fear despite their desperate circumstances. It was exactly the kind of courage that Morrison had come to expect from his team, men who faced impossible odds without hesitation. The engineer was watching the tactical situation develop with apparent interest. Your pilots are skilled, he commented, but they are trapped. My people have been preparing for this day for months. Morrison looked at the prisoner sharply. What do you know about this? The engineer smiled slightly. I know that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. You came for me, but perhaps I was the bait in a larger trap. The implications of the statement hit Morrison immediately. If the engineer was correct, then the entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. Taliban forces had known that American special operations teams would eventually target the bomb maker, and they had prepared accordingly. The SEAL team had walked into a carefully planned ambush. But there was no time to fully process the intelligence implications. The immediate priority was getting his team out alive, and that was becoming more difficult with each passing minute. Enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions, and the helicopters were running out of options. The A-10 pilot's voice interrupted his thoughts. Nighthawk flight, I'm running low on ammunition and fuel. I can make one more attack run before I have to return to base. Morrison realized that they were about to lose their close air support just when they needed it most. The Predator drone was still overhead, but it had a limited number of missiles and would be less effective against the large number of targets they were facing. Williams moved to Morrison's side and pointed toward a narrow canyon that branched off from the main valley. "Sir, what about that route? Looks like it might connect to the next valley over." Morrison studied the canyon through his binoculars. It was barely wide enough for the helicopters to navigate, and the walls were so steep that any enemy fire from above would be almost impossible to avoid. But it might be their only chance to escape the trap that was closing around them. The decision would have to be made quickly. Every minute they remained in the valley gave Taliban forces more time to position themselves for a final assault. Morrison looked around at his team one more time, knowing that his next decision could determine whether they all made it home alive. The sound of approaching enemy vehicles was now audible over the noise of the helicopter engines, and Morrison could see dust clouds on the valley floor indicating large numbers of fighters moving toward their position. Time was running out, and help from above was about to disappear. They would have to rely on their training, their equipment, and their courage to survive what was shaping up to be the fight of their lives. The rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors grew stronger as two MH-60 Black Hawks approached the compound through the darkness. Morrison could hear the distinctive sound of their engines straining against the thin mountain air, each aircraft carrying a crew willing to risk their lives to extract his team. But the Taliban fighters surrounding the compound had also heard the helicopters, and their response was immediate and overwhelming. Tracer rounds lit up the night sky as dozens of automatic weapons opened fire on the approaching aircraft. The lead helicopter banked sharply to avoid a rocket-propelled grenade that streaked past its nose, the explosion illuminating the entire valley for several seconds. Morrison watched through a window as the helicopter pilots performed evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible for less experienced crews. The radio crackled with the voice of the lead pilot, SEAL 7, "This is Nighthawk 1. Landing zone appears compromised. We need you to clear a path to the north side of the compound." Morrison looked toward the north wall of the compound where several Taliban fighters had taken position behind concrete barriers. Getting to that location would require his team to fight their way across the entire compound while under fire from multiple directions. It was a nearly impossible task, but it was their only chance for extraction. "Williams, take Chen and clear the north wall," Morrison ordered. "Ramirez, you and Thompson provide covering fire from here. Rodriguez and Martinez, help me move the prisoner." The team sprang into action with the fluid coordination that came from years of training together. Williams and Chen disappeared into the smoke-filled compound, their weapons firing short, controlled bursts as they advanced toward their objective. Ramirez set up his sniper rifle in a window and began engaging targets on the surrounding rooftops. Morrison grabbed the engineer by his restraints and pulled him toward the door. The bomb maker was surprisingly cooperative, perhaps realizing that his best chance of survival lay with the Americans rather than staying in a compound that was about to become the target of helicopter gunfire. Outside the workshop, the compound had become a war zone. Concrete chips flew through the air as bullets struck the walls around them. Smoke grenades thrown by the Taliban fighters reduced visibility to just a few meters, making it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Morrison had to rely on his night vision equipment and his knowledge of where his team members were positioned. The captured engineer stumbled and fell, crying out in Pashto as a bullet passed close to his head. Morrison hauled him back to his feet and continued moving toward the north wall. Behind them, Rodriguez provided covering fire with his machine gun, the heavy weapon chattering constantly as he engaged targets throughout the compound. A Taliban fighter appeared from behind a wall, his AK-47 aimed directly at Morrison and his prisoner. Before the enemy could fire, Martinez's rifle cracked once, and the fighter dropped to the ground. The young SEAL had made a perfect shot under extreme pressure, saving Morrison's life and keeping the mission on track. Williams's voice came over the radio, "North wall secured. 2 enemy Kia, path is clear." Morrison could see the north wall ahead, where Williams and Chen had established a defensive position. Beyond the wall, he could hear the helicopters maneuvering for landing, their door gunners laying down suppressing fire on enemy positions around the compound. The extraction was within reach, but they still had to cross the most dangerous ground. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the compound as a Taliban rocket-propelled grenade struck the workshop they had just left. The entire building collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris, flames shooting through the windows. If they had waited even 2 minutes longer, the entire team would have been trapped inside. The lead helicopter pilot's voice was urgent. "SEAL 7, we're taking heavy fire and running low on fuel. You have approximately 3 minutes before we have to abort." 3 minutes to cross 40 meters of open ground while under fire from an unknown number of enemy fighters. Morrison had been in difficult situations before, but this was among the worst. The Taliban fighters seemed willing to sacrifice themselves to prevent the Americans from escaping, and they had the advantage of fighting on familiar terrain. Morrison reached the north wall where Williams and Chen had taken cover. Both SEALs were breathing heavily, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. Williams had a minor cut on his forehead from flying concrete, but both men were still combat effective. "What's the situation?" Morrison asked, having to shout over the sound of gunfire and helicopter engines. Williams pointed toward the landing zone, a small clearing about 30 meters beyond the compound wall. "2 helicopters on approach, but they can't land until we suppress the enemy fire from that building." He indicated a 2-story structure where muzzle flashes indicated at least 4 Taliban fighters. Chen was already preparing smoke grenades to obscure their movement across the open ground. The team medic had proven himself to be an exceptional combat soldier, never hesitating when the situation required him to fight rather than provide medical care. Morrison made a quick tactical assessment. The enemy building dominated the landing zone, making it impossible for the helicopters to land safely. His team would have to neutralize those fighters before extraction could proceed. But they were running out of time and ammunition, and the Taliban reinforcements continued to arrive. "Ramirez, can you take out the fighters in the building?" Morrison called into his radio. The sniper's response was immediate. "Negative, sir. Wrong angle from my position. Would need to relocate, and there's too much enemy fire." Morrison realized that the only way to clear the building was a direct assault. It meant leaving cover and advancing across open ground while under fire, but there were no other options. The helicopters couldn't wait much longer, and every minute they delayed gave the Taliban more time to organize their defenses. "Williams, Chen, we're going to assault that building. Rodriguez and Martinez will provide covering fire from the wall. Ramirez will engage targets of opportunity from his position." Morrison looked at each of his men. "This is our only shot. Everyone ready?" The SEALs nodded, checking their weapons one final time. Each man carried grenades in addition to their rifles, and they would use every piece of equipment at their disposal. The assault would be fast and violent, designed to overwhelm the enemy defenders before they could react effectively. Morrison threw the first smoke grenade, followed immediately by Chen and Williams. Within seconds, thick gray smoke filled the area between the compound wall and the target building. The smoke would provide concealment, but it would also hide enemy positions from the advancing SEALs. "Go! Go! Go!" Morrison shouted, leading his team over the wall and into the smoke. The 3 SEALs moved in a tight formation, their weapons ready as they advanced toward the building. Behind them, Rodriguez's machine gun provided covering fire, the heavy weapon keeping enemy heads down while the assault team maneuvered. Martinez added his rifle fire to the suppression, his shots precisely aimed at windows and doorways where enemy fighters might appear. A Taliban fighter emerged from the smoke directly in front of them, his rifle aimed at Williams. Chen reacted instantly, tackling the enemy soldier and driving him to the ground. The 2 men fought hand-to-hand for several seconds before Chen managed to subdue his opponent with a knife strike. It was exactly the kind of close-quarters combat that SEAL training prepared them for. Morrison and Williams continued toward the building while Chen secured the neutralized enemy fighter. The structure was typical of Afghan construction: thick walls, small windows, and a flat roof that could serve as a fighting position. Smoke was pouring from the windows where the Taliban fighters had thrown their own grenades, making it difficult to see inside. Williams kicked in the front door while Morrison covered him from the side. The interior of the building was dark and filled with smoke, but their night vision equipment allowed them to see several enemy fighters positioned on the second floor. The Taliban fighters had the advantage of height and defensive positions, but the SEALs had superior equipment and training. Morrison threw a fragmentation grenade toward the stairs leading to the second floor, the explosion shaking the entire building and filling the air with dust and debris. Williams followed immediately, his rifle firing controlled bursts as he advanced up the stairs. Morrison provided covering fire from the ground floor, engaging any targets that appeared in the windows or doorways. The firefight inside the building lasted less than 30 seconds, but it seemed like hours to the participants. Williams encountered 2 Taliban fighters on the second floor, neutralizing both with precise rifle fire. Morrison cleared the ground floor, finding evidence that more fighters had been present but had apparently fled when the assault began. "Building clear," Williams reported over the radio. The helicopter pilot's voice immediately responded, "Roger that. Coming in for landing now. 30 seconds to wheels down." Morrison and Williams exited the building to find Chen securing the immediate area around the landing zone. The young medic had moved with the assault team and was now ensuring that no enemy fighters could threaten the helicopters during the extraction. His movement under fire had been textbook perfect, demonstrating the high level of training that all SEALs received. The sound of the approaching helicopters was now overwhelming as both aircraft descended toward the landing zone. The door gunners were firing continuously at enemy positions around the compound, their weapons creating a protective umbrella over the extraction site. Morrison could see the crew chiefs preparing to receive his team and their prisoner. Ramirez's voice came over the radio, multiple enemy vehicles approaching from the village. Estimate 20 to 30 fighters. Morrison looked toward the village and could see headlights moving toward their position. The Taliban forces were making a final push to prevent the extraction, bringing up every available fighter for one last assault. The timing would be critical. If the helicopters were still on the ground when those reinforcements arrived, everyone would be trapped. The first helicopter touched down, its rotors creating a massive dust cloud that obscured vision in all directions. Morrison could see the crew chief gesturing for them to approach, but he knew they had to wait for the rest of the team to reach the landing zone. Rodriguez and Martinez appeared through the smoke, carrying their heavy weapons and ammunition. Both men were moving at a dead run, knowing that every second counted. Behind them, Morrison could see muzzle flashes as Taliban fighters in the compound continued to fire at the helicopters. Ramirez was the last to arrive, having remained in his sniper position until the final moment to provide overwatch for the team's movement. The experienced NCO had managed to carry all of his equipment while moving under fire, demonstrating the physical conditioning that was required of all SEAL team members. Morrison pushed the engineer toward the helicopter, where crew members helped load him into the cabin. The bomb maker was conscious and alert, his eyes taking in everything around him. Morrison wondered what the man was thinking as he watched American soldiers risk their lives to extract him alive rather than simply killing him and leaving his body behind. The team loaded into both helicopters with practiced efficiency, each SEAL knowing exactly where to position himself and his equipment. The aircraft were heavily loaded with fuel, weapons, and personnel, but the pilots had calculated that they had enough power to clear the surrounding mountains even at the current altitude and temperature. As the helicopters lifted off, Taliban fighters emerged from positions throughout the compound and village, firing everything they had at the departing aircraft. Tracer rounds streaked past the windows, and Morrison could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the fuselage. One round struck the helicopter's armor plating, creating a spider web crack in the window near his head. The pilot banked sharply to avoid a rocket-propelled grenade, the aircraft tilting at an angle that pressed Morrison against his seat. Through the window, he could see the compound falling away below them, smoke rising from multiple buildings that had been damaged in the firefight. The village looked peaceful in the moonlight, but Morrison knew that it would be some time before the Taliban forces stopped looking for signs of the American team. The second helicopter stayed close to the lead aircraft, both pilots maintaining radio contact as they navigated through the mountain valleys toward friendly territory. The flight would take approximately 40 minutes, carrying them over some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan. Enemy forces throughout the region would be alerted to their presence, making the entire route potentially dangerous. Chen was checking each team member for injuries, using a small flashlight to examine wounds and assess the team's overall condition. Ramirez had suffered a minor shrapnel wound to his arm, but it was not serious enough to require immediate medical evacuation. Williams had several cuts from flying concrete, but, again, nothing that threatened his life or combat effectiveness. Morrison looked around at his team and felt a surge of pride in their performance. They had accomplished their mission under extremely difficult circumstances, capturing a high-value target and extracting him alive despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Every man had performed beyond the standard expected of elite warriors, demonstrating courage and skill under fire. But he also knew that their ordeal was far from over. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces throughout the region had been alerted to the operation, and enemy fighters would be watching every possible extraction route. The helicopters would have to navigate through hostile airspace for the next 30 minutes, and anything could happen during that time. The engineer sat quietly in his restraints, his eyes closed as if in meditation or prayer. Morrison wondered what the man was thinking about his situation. As a former university professor, he was educated enough to understand the intelligence value he represented to American forces. His cooperation could save lives on both sides of the conflict, but his hatred for coalition forces ran deep. Rodriguez was monitoring radio communications, listening to reports from other units in the area. Several Afghan army checkpoints had reported unusual Taliban movement, suggesting that enemy forces were indeed mobilizing in response to the SEAL team's operation. The next few hours would determine whether they had stirred up more trouble than they could handle. The helicopter suddenly banked hard to the left as the pilot spotted tracer rounds coming from a ridge ahead. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves along the flight route, hoping to bring down the extraction helicopters with small arms fire. The door gunners returned fire immediately, their weapons lighting up the darkness as they engaged targets on the ground. Morrison could hear the pilot talking to the second helicopter, coordinating evasive maneuvers to avoid the enemy fire. Both aircraft were flying at maximum speed while staying as low as possible to avoid giving enemy fighters easy targets. The pilots were some of the most experienced special operations aviators in the military, but they were being pushed to their limits. Another burst of tracer fire streaked past the helicopter, this time from a different direction. Taliban fighters had apparently set up multiple ambush positions along the route, turning the extraction into a running firefight through the mountains. Morrison realized that the enemy had been planning this operation for some time, possibly weeks or months. The radio crackled with a new voice, "Nighthawk Flight, this is Reaper 2-1. We have eyes on enemy positions and are cleared to engage." Morrison looked through the window and could see the distinctive shape of a Predator drone circling high above their position. The unmanned aircraft was armed with Hellfire missiles and could provide close air support during the extraction. Help was indeed coming from above, in more ways than one. The drone pilot's voice was calm and professional. "Nighthawk Flight, recommend you maintain current heading. We're engaging the ambush positions now." Explosions lit up the mountainside as the drone's missiles struck enemy positions. Morrison could see secondary explosions as ammunition and weapons caches were destroyed in the attacks. The Taliban fighters who had been firing at the helicopters were now fighting for their own survival as precision-guided weapons eliminated their positions one by one. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Morrison knew that the enemy would have more surprises waiting for them. Taliban forces were resourceful and determined, willing to take significant risks to achieve their objectives. The extraction was far from over, and the most dangerous moments might still lie ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his night vision goggles and checked his watch. It was 0530 hours, and SEAL Team 7 had been moving through the mountains for 3 days straight. Their mission was supposed to be simple: locate and capture a high-value target known as the Engineer, a bomb maker whose devices had killed dozens of American soldiers over the past 6 months. Morrison looked back at his team of 8 elite warriors. Each man carried over 60 pounds of gear, including weapons, ammunition, communications equipment, and survival supplies. They moved like ghosts through the terrain, their footsteps silent despite the rocky ground beneath their boots. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were Navy SEALs, warriors who had survived some of the most demanding training in the world. Petty Officer First Class Carlos Ramirez took point, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Behind him moved Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Chen, the team's medic, followed by Chief Petty Officer Marcus Williams, a veteran of 4 deployments. The rest of the team spread out in tactical formation, each man knowing exactly where his teammates were without needing to look. Their target was believed to be hiding in a remote village called Kostpatel, nestled in a valley between two mountain ridges. Intelligence reports indicated that the engineer had been using the village as a base of operations, building improvised explosive devices in a compound on the eastern edge of the settlement. The local population was believed to be sympathetic to Taliban forces, making the mission even more dangerous. Morrison had studied the intelligence reports for weeks before the mission began. The engineer was not just any bomb maker. He was a former university professor who had joined the Taliban after coalition forces accidentally killed his family in an airstrike 3 years earlier. His bombs were sophisticated, often using components that were nearly impossible to detect. He had become a priority target for Special Operations Command. The team had inserted by helicopter 40 miles from the target location 3 nights earlier. They had been moving on foot ever since, avoiding roads and known Taliban routes. Their communications with headquarters were limited to scheduled check-ins every 12 hours to maintain operational security. The last check-in had been at midnight, and everything had been proceeding according to plan. As they crested a ridge overlooking the valley, Morrison called for a halt. Through his binoculars, he could see the village spread out below them. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could make out figures moving between the mud brick buildings. The compound they were looking for sat apart from the main village, surrounded by a low wall and accessed by a single dirt road. Target building confirmed, Morrison whispered into his radio. Proceeding to observation post. The team moved down the ridge to a predetermined location that offered good visibility of the target while providing concealment. They would spend the day observing the compound, looking for patterns of movement and identifying potential threats. The actual assault would take place after dark, giving them the advantage of superior night vision equipment. Ramirez set up his sniper rifle and began cataloging every person who entered or left the compound. Chen established a casualty collection point and prepared his medical supplies. Williams coordinated with the other team members to establish fields of fire and escape routes. Each SEAL knew his job and performed it with quiet efficiency. As the day progressed, they observed normal village activities. Children played in the streets while women carried water from a well in the center of town. Men worked in small fields surrounding the village, tending to crops that would feed their families through the coming winter. It seemed peaceful, but Morrison knew that appearances could be deceiving in this part of Afghanistan. Around noon, a pickup truck arrived at the compound. 3 men got out and carried several boxes inside. The team watched carefully, photographing the men and noting the time of their arrival. One of the men appeared to match the description of the engineer, medium height, dark beard, wearing traditional Afghan clothing. But they needed to be certain before taking action. 2 hours later, the same truck left with 2 of the men. The third man, the one who might be the engineer, remained inside the compound. Morrison made the decision to move closer for a positive identification. He selected Chen and Williams to accompany him, leaving the rest of the team at the observation post to provide overwatch. The 3 SEALs moved carefully down the ridge, using vegetation and rock formations for concealment. It took them nearly an hour to reach a position within 200 meters of the compound. From this distance, Morrison could clearly see through the compound's windows using his high-powered binoculars. Inside one of the buildings, a man was working at a table covered with electronic components. Wires, circuit boards, and small explosive devices were scattered across the workspace. The man's hands moved with practiced skill as he assembled what was clearly an improvised explosive device. Morrison compared the man's face to the photographs in his mission folder. There was no doubt. This was the engineer. Morrison signaled to his team members that they had positive identification. According to the mission plan, they would return to the observation post and wait for darkness before launching their assault. But, as they prepared to move back up the ridge, Williams spotted movement on the road leading to the village. A convoy of vehicles was approaching from the north. Through his binoculars, Williams could see armed men in the vehicles. Taliban fighters were coming to the village, and there were a lot of them. Morrison counted at least 30 fighters in 6 vehicles. This was not part of the intelligence briefing. The village was supposed to be lightly defended. The three SEALs moved quickly back to their observation post and briefed the rest of the team on what they had seen. The Taliban convoy was now entering the village, and fighters were taking positions around the compound. What had been planned as a quick in and out operation was becoming something much more complicated. Morrison radioed headquarters to report the changed situation. The response was immediate. Mission parameters remained unchanged. They were to capture or kill the engineer and extract to the designated pickup point 12 miles away. The fact that the village was now crawling with Taliban fighters was considered an acceptable risk. As evening approached, the team prepared for the assault. Each SEAL checked his weapons and equipment one final time. They would move in 3 teams of 3, with Morrison leading the assault team directly to the compound. Williams would lead a support team to establish a perimeter, while Ramirez would remain on the ridge with his sniper rifle to provide long-range support. The plan was to breach the compound's wall using explosive charges, neutralize any guards, and capture the engineer alive if possible. Intelligence wanted him for interrogation. If capture was not possible, he was to be killed to prevent his escape. The entire operation was expected to take no more than 15 minutes from start to finish. At 2100 hours, the team began their final approach. The village had grown quiet as darkness fell. Most of the Taliban fighters had taken shelter inside buildings, but Morrison could see sentries posted at key locations throughout the village. Getting to the compound without being detected would require all of their skill and training. The assault team moved through the darkness like shadows. Their night vision equipment gave them a significant advantage over the enemy, who would be relying on natural night vision and scattered light sources. Each step was carefully planned and executed, with the SEALs communicating through hand signals and whispered radio transmissions. They reached the compound wall without being detected. Morrison placed explosive charges at 2 points along the wall while his team members prepared to rush through the breaches. The charges were small and focused, designed to create openings without alerting the entire village to their presence. But, as Morrison prepared to detonate the charges, the situation suddenly changed. Bright lights flashed on throughout the compound, illuminating the area like daylight. Voices shouted in Pashto, and the sound of weapons being loaded filled the air. The element of surprise was gone. The SEALs had walked into a trap. Somehow, the Taliban had known they were coming. As automatic weapons fire erupted from positions around the compound, Morrison realized that his team was in serious trouble. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Williams's voice crackled over the radio, "Contact!" taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Ramirez's sniper rifle boomed from the ridge as he engaged targets around the compound, but there were too many enemy fighters for one sniper to handle. The support team was pinned down behind a stone wall, unable to advance or retreat. Morrison made a split-second decision. Instead of retreating, he detonated the charges and led his assault team through the breaches in the compound wall. If they were going to fight, they would fight on their terms. The compound offered better cover than the open ground, and they still had a mission to complete. The 3 SEALs rushed through the smoke and debris of the explosion, their weapons firing at muzzle flashes in the darkness. The compound was larger than it had appeared from the ridge, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. Taliban fighters were positioned throughout the complex, making movement dangerous and unpredictable. Chen moved left toward what intelligence had identified as the main workshop. Williams went right toward the living quarters. Morrison headed straight for the largest building, where they had observed the engineer working earlier in the day. Each SEAL was now fighting alone, relying on years of training and combat experience to survive. The firefight intensified as more Taliban fighters arrived from the village. The sound of AK-47s and RPGs filled the air, mixing with the sharper crack of American weapons. Explosions rocked the compound as grenades detonated against stone walls, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. Morrison reached the workshop building and kicked in the door. Inside, the engineer was trying to escape through a back window. Morrison tackled him before he could get away, zip-tying his hands behind his back despite the chaos erupting around them. The primary mission objective was complete, but getting out alive was now the main concern. Williams's voice came over the radio, strained and urgent. Building cleared. No additional targets. Chen responded immediately. Workshop secured. Found bomb-making materials and documents. But their situation was becoming desperate. Taliban reinforcements continued to arrive, and the team was running low on ammunition. The original plan to fight their way to the extraction point 12 miles away was no longer viable. They were surrounded and outgunned, with limited options for escape. Morrison looked at the captured bomb maker and made another critical decision. They would have to call for immediate extraction from their current location. It meant exposing the helicopter crew to enemy fire, but staying in the compound meant certain death for the entire team. He keyed his radio and transmitted the code words that every special operations soldier hopes never to use: broken arrow. Broken arrow. Immediate extraction required. The response from headquarters was immediate: extraction team inbound. Hold position for 30 minutes. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours. The compound was being overrun with Taliban fighters, and the SEALs were running out of ammunition and options. They consolidated their position in the main workshop building, using furniture and equipment to barricade the windows and doors. Outside, the enemy was organizing for a final assault. Morrison could hear vehicles moving into position and fighters shouting orders to each other. It was only a matter of time before they brought up heavy weapons or simply overwhelmed the SEAL team through sheer numbers. The captured engineer looked at Morrison with hatred in his eyes. "You will all die here," he said in accented English. "This village is our sanctuary. No American leaves alive." Morrison ignored the taunt and checked his ammunition. He had 3 magazines left, maybe 90 rounds total. Around him, his team members were in similar situations. They had trained for scenarios like this, but training never fully prepared anyone for the reality of being surrounded by enemy forces in hostile territory. Williams appeared at Morrison's shoulder. "Sir, we've got movement on all sides. They're getting ready to rush us." Morrison nodded. "How much ammunition does everyone have?" The answer was not encouraging. The team had enough bullets for maybe 10 more minutes of intense fighting. After that, they would be reduced to fighting with knives and grenades at close quarters. Chen was treating a minor shrapnel wound on Ramirez's arm when he looked up at Morrison. "What's the plan, sir?" Morrison looked around at his team. These were the finest warriors America had ever produced, men who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions their country could offer. They had families waiting for them at home, dreams and plans that extended far beyond this compound in Afghanistan. But they were also professionals who understood the risks of their chosen profession. "We hold until extraction arrives," Morrison said simply. "No matter what." The sound of approaching helicopters suddenly filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. But with the sound of salvation came increased enemy fire as Taliban fighters realized what was happening. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked across the compound, exploding against buildings and filling the air with smoke and debris. Morrison grabbed his radio. "Extraction team, this is SEAL 7. Landing zone is extremely hot. Recommend immediate abort." The helicopter pilot's voice was calm and professional. "Negative, SEAL 7. We're coming to get you. Mark your position with infrared strobes." As the sound of rotors grew deafeningly loud overhead, Morrison realized that their ordeal was far from over. The most dangerous part of any extraction was the moment when warriors had to leave cover and run to the landing zone. In this case, that meant crossing 40 meters of open ground under enemy fire while carrying a prisoner and maintaining their equipment. The next few minutes would determine whether SEAL Team 7 made it home alive, or became another casualty statistic in America's longest war. The siege was about to reach its most critical phase.